Well, welcome. My name is Dr. Frank A. Thomas, and I am privileged to be the director of the world's only PhD program in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. I want you to know that I direct the program, that we have a mission to archive the genius, the power, the depth, the beauty, the imagination, and the creativity of African American preaching in order to generate a preaching renaissance to revive American Christianity in the 21st century. I happen to believe that Christianity is in need of revival in this 21st century. And African American preaching is one of the vehicles that God is going to use. So we work on generating, archiving, writing, talking to, interviewing the genius of Black preaching, because we believe it can generate a revival in American Christianity. So tonight, let me give you a little background. We have a very special guest, our fabulous preacher, Reverend Jasper Williams is with us to share. And this journey got started when I wrote a book called How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon. That book was released in 2018. And as I went around the country lecturing and teaching and preaching out of the book, people continue to ask me, Pastor, I want to preach dangerous sermons, or Dr. Thomas, I want to preach dangerous sermons, but how do I survive them? If I preach as you suggest, how do I remain employed? Because, dangerous sermons get you in a lot of trouble. As I was writing a book called Surviving a Dangerous Sermon, I listened to, this is a copy of the picture of the book right here, Surviving a Dangerous Sermon. It's available on Amazon. You can pick it up. We're going to come back to it later on. As I was writing the book, I watched the eulogy of Aretha Franklin delivered by Pastor Jasper Williams. And what I heard was a dangerous sermon. What I did an analysis of that sermon. As a matter of fact, in Surviving a Dangerous Sermon, there's an entire chapter in it's called Something Must Be Done, a rhetorical reading of Aretha Franklin's eulogy by Pastor Jasper Williams. That was one of his themes. Something must be done. He said it about something must be done. So because I believe that we ought to not publish stuff on each other without sharing it with each other, I sent Pastor Williams and his team a copy of the chapter. Well, one thing led to another, and following our conversation, we had just a good conversation about it. I invited him to do an interview, to which he most heartedly agreed. So we're thankful to have Pastor Jasper. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm excited to have you. One of the things that you heard me say is that we archive African American preaching, and you are one of the giants in African American preaching, and you've been preaching for 70 years. So what I'd like to do in this interview is to pick your brain about your preaching, what you've learned about preaching, who mentored you. I want to talk a little bit about the Reverend C.L. Franklin. I want to then, following that, I want to talk a little bit about the eulogy of Aretha Franklin and the dangerous sermon and what happened. And then finally, just to take some questions we have our PhD students in our program on the line, and I want to take some questions from them, and that'll wrap up our evening. So thank you so very much for spending this time with us. Thank you so much. I'll say this, and then I'll open for any comments that you would like to say. One of the reasons that I've done a numerous amount of these interviews, and up on my YouTube channel, I have a bunch of them, because so much of the genius of African American preaching goes to the grave with the preacher. And we want to capture this genius. We don't want it to go to the grave. And so that's part and parcel of why I work so hard, because I just believe that the hope for American Christianity in the 21st century is in the Black pulpit, is in Black preaching. So let me say welcome to you, and we're so excited to have you, and thank you for being here. Any comments initial comments? I got a couple questions I want to ask you, but I want to give you a chance to just kind of warm up and say hello to the audience before I start hitting you with questions. So anything you want to say?
The only thing that I like to say at this point is that you honor me by asking me to do this. I am really, really honored that you would. to put me on the level of the PhDs, as you have so well earned, and all of the people who surround you and help you to do what you do. Believe me, I'm honored and I'm privileged to sit here on this end, and hopefully we can accomplish what you want to accomplish in this.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. So, let's get started. So, for people that only probably in the African American community, you have such a wide reach and scope, and people are familiar with you. But just in case there might be a few people that are not familiar with Pastor Jasper Williams, what would you like for the audience to know about you?
Well, my name is Jasper W. Williams Jr. I was born July the 22nd, 1943. In this coming July, I'll be 77 years of age. And on the second Sunday in August, I shall have been preaching for 70 years. I started on the second Sunday in August of 1950.
Wow.
My mother recorded it in my father's Bible, stating that I preached that Sunday evening at 6 o'clock and that they gave me $8.42. And Mama said that. And then on the second Sunday in November of 1963, I became pastor of Salem Now Bible Church, which is the only church I've ever been privileged to pastor. And so this coming November, I shall have pastored for 57 years.
Wow. 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 Wow.
So I think that is a generalized synopsis of me, I would think.
Yes, thank you. Tell us about your call to ministry.
The call to ministry started with my father, Reverend J.W. Williams Sr. He was like a guru preacher of the Mid-South. He was on WDIA every Sunday, and it was a time when he got on a 50,000 watt station that carried him over the whole Mid-South. He always raised me, Doctor, on the fact that he saw me before he ever knew my mother, that God had shown him that he would birth a preacher, a boy, and that he would be a preacher. And he would always say to me that he would be a world's wonder. And so as a kid, I came up with that in me. So when you ask me about my calling, I think that the calling was more not about seeing anything or hearing anything. The calling was more of an urge, a deep, sincere desire to preach that was hovered in me from birth. And so it's all I've ever known. He was a preacher. My grandfather was a Methodist preacher. My uncle was a preacher at Whitestone Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. So being in the environment and coming from that kind of heritage, I think all contributed to what I would categorize as being my call.
So what kind of preacher was your father?
My dad, that's a great question. I appreciate that question because everything started with him. He was a self-made man who lived in Mississippi. It was in Mississippi that he and Dr. Franklin came up together because they were boys kind of together, but more with my uncle. And Memphis at that time was what we called Jerusalem. It was a place where all preachers who were thought to be preachers or great pastors or preachers had to reside at some point. And so as a younger man, he always longed to come to Memphis, and he got one of the celebrated churches at that time called Columbus Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, and became pastor there. And it was there that I was born. And so he later came to Lane Avenue. He had to organize, and he built Lane Avenue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, and came to be a very well known. People would listen to him on WDIA at 2 o'clock every Sunday. I had some people to tell me they would start walking at the beginning of the street that they lived on And so many people were listening to my dad that they could walk the whole street and never miss a word he said, because all of the people on the street were listening to his broadcast. That was the kind of aura that he carried in terms of being just a great, great, great preacher. And he was as great of a man on the inside as he was a preacher on the outside.
So tell me, about his preaching. Was he a hooper? I mean, tell me, because where I'm pressing is,
okay, I got you.
We want to understand you and your preaching. It probably starts there. That's where I'm going to.
He was the daddy of the hoopers. Let me put it to you like that. Yes, he was a hooper, but the thing that impressed me most about him is that he did not want anybody to think that hooping was all he could do.
Yeah.
So much so until when he was well past 50 years of age, he decided to go back to school and went to Booker T. Washington Night School, got his high school diploma, and then he went to S.A. Owens Junior College and finished there. And then he went to Russ College, would drive to Holly Springs, Mississippi every day until he got his college degree. And then wanted people to recognize him not for being just a great hooper, but was one of the first blacks. He was the first black to graduate from Memphis Theological Seminary with a master's in theology.
Wow.
She sure did. Yeah. And so he died at the age of 78 years. Just a great, great man all around. So preaching, that's all he did was preach, and he hooped. That's all I knew. In the 1950s, your success as a preacher was determined by how well you hooped. You had to put your finger in your ear and you hooped in order to be recognized for being a great preacher. That was just the way it was then.
Yeah. So he seemed to be quite a mentor, and so he encouraged you in your education, I assume.
Yes. And that's where it all started.
So did he ordain you?
Yes, he did.
What year?
He ordained me, and what he did when I preached at the age of 7 years old on that second Sunday in August, I confessed my calling to him when I was 6 years of age and told him God had called me to preach. And he said, well, if the Lord has called you to preach, you're walking around here and you got these guns on you that you're shooting and going on like a cowboy. Preachers are not supposed to carry guns. So I told him, I said, well, Dad, okay, I'll put my guns down. I won't ever use them anymore. And he would always talk about the fact that I never picked up guns anymore. And he asked me another question. He says, now, what if you go and you preach for somebody and they don't give you any money? What you going to do then? And I told him, I said, well, Dad, I wouldn't be preaching for the money. I'll be preaching because I'm called to preach. I've got to preach. And he made his mind up that he would let me go, let me preach. He said, because if I answered him that way, he needed to let me go. And he took a lot of flack because I was so young, 7 years of age, and everybody criticized him for letting a 7-year-old boy preach like that. But all the flack that he got, he stood, and everywhere that he would go to preach, if school was not going on, I went with him. There were times that we did revivals together when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old. We would go and do revivals together, and he would not let me preach a night and then he get up behind me and preach. He had it understood that I would preach a night, he would preach a night. I would preach a night, he would preach a night. And he brought me up like that. And then when I would preach and whatever mistakes I made, I would get home and he would say, now you said this in your sermon and you went off, you never did come back to your subject. You got to always come back to your subject. Things like that. It all started with him. If it were not for him, it would not be me by no means. He was some kind of man. I
So
hope that
who?
gives you,
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead,
I
please.
hope that gives you a little better insight of
It
where it
does.
all really began. And then, of course, when I got ready to go to college, he told me, he said, now you can go to any school you want, because the plan was for me to go to any school, become educated. I was supposed to get a college degree and get a master's. That was the least he was expecting of me. But he really wanted me to get a PhD. But he
Mm.
said, you get you a master's and then you come back home and be co-pastor with me. Well, in my mind, when time came to go, I didn't want to come back and be co-pastor with him. I wanted to go wherever it was and get my own church. That
Mm.
was just in my heart, because I knew I couldn't be who I wanted and needed to be under his wing there, that I had to get out on my own. And so when I made the selection as to where I wanted to go to school, I chose Morehouse. And the only reason I chose Morehouse was because I had heard that Martin Luther King graduated from Morehouse. And that was the reason I selected it to come to Atlanta. And ironically, Dr. B. Joseph Johnson sat down beside my dad at the National Baptist Convention, and they began talking to each other. And my dad found out that he pastored in Atlanta. And my dad told him that he had a son that was coming to Atlanta. And he gave him his number and told me to call him when I got to Atlanta. And I did. He came and picked me up and carried me to his church and told me he would pick me up and like for me to see his church on Sundays. And I went and I sat on the pulpit for about 6 months. And he did not allow me to do anything. I didn't sing a song. I didn't pray a prayer. I didn't preach anything like that. And then one Sunday, he came in and he asked me to do the morning prayer. And he prayed. He allowed me to pray that day. And he couldn't preach after I had prayed, because the Spirit really showered on the church that day. And that's where it all began. From that moment on, he wanted me to preach. And when he announced that I was going to preach that Sunday night, you couldn't get nowhere near the church. And then it went on and on and on from that point.
Yes. So finish to how you got to be the pastor of Salem. Finish that story, and then I want to ask you another question.
Well, I began preaching behind during the revival for Reverend Johnson. There was people, the Lord, that came every night. I started on a Sunday night and preached all the way through that Friday night.
It's old school stuff. The young
That's
preachers don't know
old
nothing
school.
about that.
Old school. Well, you know, in my dad's day, we used to do 2 weeks revival. The old week didn't, wasn't enough. The first week you get warmed up, and then the second week is when the real crowd would come and the Spirit would flow.
Yeah.
And that's when the horse would run from the barn and all of that. I know about all of that in terms of that. You're exactly right. But at this time, it was the 1 week. And so I would preach. And when that revival was over, so many pastors came. And Reverend Johnson's cousin, Dr. E.H. Dorsey, stood up on that Friday night and said, "What do we have to do to get him over at Tabernacle Baptist Church?" And he said, "You have to see me." This is Dr. Johnson. He said, "You have to see me." He said, "Well, we want him over at Tabernacle." He said, "Okay, I'll let him come." And they let me come. And I got my dad to come and preach revival with me over there. And we had a great hallelujah time. And so one engagement led to another engagement, to another engagement. And may I drop this to your students who may be listening, that when God has called you, you never worry about doors being opened for you. Because if you're true to the gift of your calling, and God will always open the door at the right time. And any young preacher has got to be cognizant of the fact that God's timing is always more pertinent and important than time itself. And
Hmm.
so every door, every place I went opened up another door. It opened up another door and another door. And you don't base where you go according to the dollar.
Hmm.
I preached at a tent. It didn't have but about 25 or 30 people in the tent, but I preached. And Salem's deacons had heard about me and came and heard me preach in that tent that evening and gave me the invitation to come preach at Salem. I preached at a whole lot of churches, but everybody said I was too young. It was a big church, Mount Vernon, here in Atlanta, that I preached at, and they were getting ready to call me. They had become so excited about me preaching there. I preached a couple of times, and each time they became very, very enthused about my preaching, and they wanted me. And a lady got up in the conference that night and said, "That boy, he can preach. We enjoyed him. He was a good preacher, but he can't be my pastor. He's nothing but a boy." And so that killed me at that church at that time. But then when I went to Salem on Easter Sunday morning in 1963, as soon as my foot hit the pulpit, I just knew that was my church. And I can drop this to your students as well, that whenever you're preaching at a vacant church and you're trying to get a church, no matter what day it is on, and you trying to determine what you preach, always preach your best sermon, always. It was on Easter Sunday morning, but I preached the 23rd Psalm. And that's how I got Salem.
Now, tell me some of your other preaching mentors.
That's a great question. It's not one mentor. There are many as I go along. My dad was the very first one.
Yeah.
But then in Memphis, Tennessee, you probably remember this one, W.M. Fields Jr. at Valentine Baptist Church was a mentor. Different people contributed different things to me in my ministry. Junior Fields was a kind of a preacher that could preach about anything. I hear him right now eating from the bottom of the barrel, and when, crumbs, preaching about anything. So I would sit at his feet and let him talk to me about texts and go back and fix the sermon my way. He was a kind of a preacher that he would always talk about, you need some juice in your sermon, to not make it so bookish or to not make it so outlined to where people couldn't feel what you were saying. And so I got that from him because I listened to him, and I would fly into Memphis through the week and let him talk different sermons to me, and I would record those sermons and go back and fix them my way. I learned all of that from Fields Jr., that kind of flavoring a sermon when you want to do that. And then there was E.L. McKinney in Memphis, Tennessee, who knew how to hoop and sing. He came from the Southern Wonders, and he learned how to sing real well. It was a gift with him, and we became very good friends to where we talked every day. And I rubbed off on him, he rubbed off on me. And then, of course, that was Dr. Franklin, and those are some of the main ones who tutored me and mentored me along the way.
So how did you meet Dr. C.L. Franklin?
Well, I knew of him all of my life, but I came to know him best through my uncle. My uncle, Reverend A.R. Williams, who pastored White Stone Baptist Church, and Dr. Franklin were the best of pals. They would play checkers every day. And while they played checkers, they talked smack all the time to each other. I'm going to do this to you. And, oh, no, I'm going to do this to you. They were that kind. They were very, very close. They lived on Lucy Street in Memphis. My dad and mother lived on a certain part of Lucy Street. And my uncle and Reverend Franklin lived next door to each other. My dad was across the street from each other. All of these instances are in my book. They are recorded in my book. I have a book about all of these things. I think that
We'll
you
put it
might
up.
get a good,
Yeah,
better view.
we'll put it up. Let's keep going. We'll
Okay.
put it up.
And so with them playing checkers every day, they knew each other from Mississippi and all that kind of a thing. And of course, Reverend Franklin left Memphis and went to Buffalo, New York. And so my uncle and he kept that friendship through the years. It was just the way they were. It was a great,
Now,
great
in
background.
of course, I watched your pre-eulogy press conference and the post, but in the pre, you identify that you really felt as if you carried a mantle of C.L. Franklin. And of course, you were privileged to do the eulogy, but so talk to me just a little bit about how you see that. How was it passed to you? You know, I want to get a little bit into that. So just whatever you tell me, I'd appreciate to know.
Well, I know this. I know you're a preacher to ask those kinds of questions. I know that, and I appreciate that. Nobody but a preacher would say that. Uh, I didn't claim so much that that it was me carrying the mantle. Other people gave that to me, that I carried C.L. Franklin's mantle, that I inherited his mantle, and somehow when I preached his eulogy, they say the mantle fell to me. I don't think that the mantle is anything that a person can desire. You can desire to get a mantle from someone, but whether you get it or not has to be determined by what God does.
Yes.
And if I have inherited his mantle in whatever way people may think that I have, it was not because I feel that it's something I earned or should have gotten.
Okay.
It is just something that God favored me with.
Yes.
You know, it's just God found favor in me to give me that and to put me in the right place to do the right thing at the right time. There again, timing became everything.
Yes.
When I preached C.L. Franklin's funeral, that was something that I never asked for, had no idea that I would be asked to do it. But the reason why they did it, and here again to your students, waiting for God's time, God's timing again is more important than time will ever be. I preached C.L. Franklin's revival for 3 straight years. And the year that he passed on, it got me to preach his revival that year, and he was
6 nights, right?
Yes,
Yes. Okay. I just
6 nights, and he was comatose in a coma. But I raised an offering for him that night. I asked those people after they had given if they would come down and allow me to take an offering to Dr. Franklin because he was in a coma, and they all knew that. And all the money that they gave that night, I took it and I gave it to Aretha. I sent it to Aretha for her to use it for her father. So when he expired, then Cecil, his son, called me and asked me would I represent the family, that they wanted me to do the eulogy, and I told them that I would.
So what was it about C.L. Franklin's preaching that made him such a dynamic preacher in your estimation?
Many of C.L. Franklin's sermons would be relevant even today. He has one sermon called Black Power. And it's a sermon that challenges the Black man, even right here, right now, with where we are in the first fifth of the 21st century. He was way before his time. People did not recognize him outside of his giftedness in terms of being able to hoop like he could, but he had depthfulness in his message as well. He was just a great preacher and had a great mind, and it was far exceptional to the average preacher of his day. I think that's about the best way to put it.
Okay. Okay. I want to do a little bit with hooping. So, that's there's a lot of always controversy around hooping as to whether it's still relevant, is it still alive? This is for our audience. This is the book we referenced. We put the book on the screen. You want to say a little bit? We can stop there. I'll get this question. We'll come back to it.
We'll come back to the hooping. Okay, thank you. This is my book. It's about my life. It's It Ain't But One. That's an unusual title, you may say, but the title was given by the late Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. would always come to our church after he retired from Ebenezer Baptist Church. He would come to our church many, many Sundays. Fact about it, the Sunday evening that he died, he had just left our church. And whenever I would allow him to make comments or remarks in the worship services, he would say, well, I'm here again. You all may get tired of me coming, but I have to come because it ain't but one. Your preacher, it ain't but one. And he would always call me that. And so when I wrote my biography, we thought about various titles to name it. And it came to me that he would always say, it ain't but one. And for that reason, the writers gave it that title. This is a book that has 12 chapters in it. It talks about my life from the beginning all the way up until I preached Aretha Franklin's eulogy. Let me share with you some of the chapters. I know it's a total of 12 chapters. It talks about in my father's footsteps, caught in the shadow, a vision, my own. But one of the key chapters is young preachers beware. Young preachers beware. The cost of making a difference. And of course, the last one, which is chapter 12, is honoring the Queen of Soul.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
All right. Okay. Go back to the hoop.
Yes, let's talk about it. So tell me about it. Tell me what are you thinking? Is it still relevant? Is it going to always be relevant? You teach it. So give me some of your flavor about it.
Well, let me start out by saying something that most people would not believe. I take the position that if you want to hoop, you can. That there's no such thing as not being a hooper if you want to hoop. Anybody can hoop because everybody has something that is unique to him or herself. And the key to hooping is finding yourself. That's something in you that you do, say, or be that if you bring it out, it's nobody but you. A hoop is not, most people think you got to be able to sing well, or you got to be able to hold a note well. No, you've got to be able to find yourself well, if that's what you want to do.
Right.
I've learned through the years that hooping is not all that it once was. That it's not in 2020 what it was in 1950. In 1950, when I was coming along, if you put your finger in your ear and you squalled or you hollered, that determined how successful of a preacher you were. But here in the 21st century, you got to have depth, you got to have some meat as we talk about it, and then the hoop is the gravy if you want to do that. So to me, hooping is about identifying with our past as a people, that the emotionalism of the Black church, at the basis of it is the hooping part, if you opt to do that. The older I've gotten and the more that the pendulum has swung from the 20th century to the 21st century, is not as demanding, or I don't think it to be as needed, but it's good to have if you want to flavor your sermon.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to add something to it and you close with one hoop and sit down, nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
That just accentuates the word that you speak, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, I'm certainly not a hooper. A friend of mine, Martha Simmons, says everybody would hoop, if they could. And Dr. E.L. Branch, who just retired from Third New Hope,
I remember
explained,
I know
yeah,
Brian.
he told me he did a wonderful, I've been trying to get him to get this lecture together. And he explained closing the conference, the C.L. Franklin conference he did like about just 9-10 minutes and explained to me that to be a hooper, you had to understand scales. And so I don't really understand scales. So it's not, I'm not a hooper. And I don't have a problem with hooping. I love hooping as long as it got something to do with the message. That's my only,
Yeah.
It's got something to do with the message.
There
If
you
got
go.
to use it, just make sure that
You're
hoop
giving
is
a message.
connected.
Yes.
And we also live in an age where people will watch the close, but won't watch the sermon. They'll imitate the close. And I want the hoop to fit the sermon. And I think it's nothing better when it's done right. When you said something and then you joyfully reinforce what you've already taught to people, I don't think it gets better than that. So
I appreciate you saying that. That's great.
yeah.
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly with that. That's
But
exactly right.
it's part of our tradition. And so, I keep saying, it's pretty similar to what you're saying is my goal is to help people, to discover their uniqueness and discover their own voice. And so God don't have one style of preacher. A friend of mine, Bishop Larry Trotter, says God has a preacher for every creature. So whatever your style is or whatever your uniqueness is, God has somebody that speaks to. And so it's more about, developing. So I think I want to talk to you about, you've been preaching for 70 years. So if you had to give 3 top lessons in your 70 years of preaching, just give me just 3. I know you got about 50, but just give me 3. What would you say? Go ahead.
What would I say? What did you start?
If you had to give me 3, what would you give me?
Preparation. That's it.
So tell me about that, and then tell me, how do you prepare your sermons?
Okay. Preparation is the key. We're living in times where to keep people coming to our churches is quite challenging. And in order to do that, they've got to feel that they're going to get something when they come. And that can only come about with the preparation. You ask me, what do? I preach. But what do you do when you finish preaching? I rest from preaching. What do you do when you get through resting? I get ready to preach again. See, it's about preaching, preparing to preach. No matter what I preach, whether you agree with what I say, whether you think I'm right or wrong about what I say, I want to come off prepared with saying it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so preparation, what your students are doing now in school, learning, preparing themselves, all of them are to be tremendously congratulated for doing that, because that's what it takes. The difficulty with us right now, with the battle and challenges that we have with our churches today, is because the pulpit lacks preparation. You got to have concentration and consecration. You can't successfully mount a pulpit and you have not consecrated. It goes hand in hand. I'm an adamant person about preparing myself for a pulpit. And, preaching means so much to me that if and when I get to where I can't do it, I'm through with the world. There's nothing else that I want from it. Nothing. I'm ready to go. Nothing. I'm ready.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Reverend.
I'm ready to die when I get to where I can't preach.
Yeah, to the audience, I'm laughing because I have a bunch of these interviews on YouTube, and I say to people that what makes it so much fun to me is I deeply love preaching. And when you get two, I said this to Pastor Williams yesterday, when you have two people who deeply love preaching, it sparks fly. So I knew, and I said to you yesterday, I said, this was not going to be hard at all. I mean, because, you just expressed how much you love preaching.
Yes.
And it's just something about it. It's something about Black preaching. It's nothing like it when it's done well and it's done right. So let me ask you, I'm going to ask you another question.
Okay, but I want to say to close that point out.
Go ahead.
I don't preach to live. I live to preach. I like to close with that.
Okay.
Go right on.
Now, I want you to tell us about a time in your ministry where you thought God really used you in your preaching. Give me a moment that, I know that as preachers, many of us are modest and shy and, bashful, but, we overly criticize ourselves when we don't do well. But sometimes God really uses us. So when was the time that God really, 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 really used you as a preacher?
Well, there's one, I like to think that there are perhaps innumerable times, but there's one particular time with you asking me that question that just popped up in my mind. I had, at our church, I had a minister of music that I had to terminate. And it was one of those times in the pastorate where you have to make decisions that you know are going to backfire on you because this person is so popular in the church that it almost like challenges you, though you're a pastor of the church. And so I had to make the decision to let this person go. And the people didn't like that. And so the first Sunday that the person was gone, I had done everything that I could to write the word, consecrated myself to the nth. I had prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. And I was so in tune with the sermon until, Frank, how when you study a sermon to the point that it's beyond memorization, it's beyond you being able to pull it up by memory, you become consumed with it to where it just walks. Every time you take a step, that sermon is there. You're so familiar with, so into it, so godly associated with that particular sermon. I had gotten that way with this particular sermon on that first Sunday, and the church was jam-packed. And I came into that church that day, and in that moment, I knew, it was like the burning bush experience, that this is God, that God really met me at that moment. I'll never forget that moment.
So tell me what happened, and then I'm going to ask you another question. So how did the Spirit fell on the church?
Spirit fell on the church. All of us were just consumed by the Holy Ghost that day. And it like preached the devil out and it let me know that God was really with me like never before.
So you may have just told me that, but I want you to go to the other side, because as pastors and preachers, we have particularly difficult seasons or moments when we, that text that says in season and out of season is very real. So what would be the most difficult time, either your personal life or going on in the church, where you really had to get up and stand behind that pulpit and preach that word despite difficult circumstances?
Well, when I had a battle with drugs, that was a very, very difficult time for me. And when I got out of rehab and to have to go to the pulpit that first Sunday after I had come out of rehab, it was very, very hard for me. Very, very hard for me. I guess the reason why I'm wanting to be so transparent about that part of my life is because I know that the young men who are in your classes, there are going to be times that they're going to be challenged, perhaps, with that. I had a battle with drugs, and it was in that 30-day time frame that I really found myself and found God again. Let me put it that way. I've thought about that subject for another good sermon, when you find God again.
Yeah.
So when I had to preach behind that, it was one of those turning moments. I could hear my daddy's voice talking about how I had disappointed him. I could hear all of the people in my church voice being disappointed and how I had let people down. And something needs to be done to where when preachers run into difficulty like this, we have people that come to us all the time when their wells run dry, and yet our well can run dry. And the question is, where do we go?
Yeah.
So I had to come through all of that, but God brought me. Nobody but the Lord brought me through all of that, gave me another chance. When I got back to my church, the way I dealt with the situation was, after I had preached that particular Sunday, I stood up and I told the membership, I said, well, I know that many of you have heard about where I have been. And I'm not going to say here, there, yea, or nay, but I tell you what I will do. All of you who would like to know where I have been and what I've done for the last 30 days, please feel free to come to my office, ask me, and I'll tell you. And nobody came. And it was their way, I think, of saying to me that they were with me no matter what.
Yes. Doc, we got both men and women and students on as part of the PhD students.
Okay.
I want to follow up that with the question: what was the text? Did you take a text? Was there a sermon? Do you remember the text you preached?
On what?
On that Sunday you came back out of rehab.
Oh, no. I don't remember that. I sure don't. I don't remember. That's a great question. Yeah, I wished I could. It was March the 7th, 1984 was when I went into rehab.
Okay. I want to thank you for that transparency, because, some of the reasons that I asked that question is because people look at celebrated preachers and don't realize there's another side of the story.
Yes.
That there have been storms that God has brought us through.
Yes.
And that, we can reach for, I call it cash, cameras, and crowds. We can reach for it. But if we get a hold to it, it's a lot more than what we had known it to be. And that in some ways, God has to get us back on track. So thank you for that. I appreciate your transparency. It's going to help some preachers somewhere in a tremendous way. So thank you so much.
I hope it does. And there's a chapter dedicated to young preachers, hopefully, in that book.
Okay.
In my book.
All right. I want you to talk to me a little bit. You were the head of late night preaching for the National Baptist Convention.
Yes.
And amongst African Americans, at least in, that particular generation, it was celebrated as, the zenith. So I want you to talk to me just a little bit. Don't have to be long or short. I didn't want to go by and not mention that as part of your ministry. So just talk to me a little bit about late night.
The late night services, that's another one of those things that God gave me at the right time. I had no idea that I would be chairman of the late night services of the National Baptist Convention. I had not even gone to the National Baptist Convention. I was not even a participant in it, but Dr. T.J. Jemison became president, and Cameron Alexander had him for a banquet and asked me to be the master of ceremonies. And I did. I raised money for Dr. Jemison and all of that. And that night he appointed me to be over the late night services of the National Baptist Convention. And so I took it. It had been in churches all of those years, but I was able to put it in the ballroom of the headquarters of the National Baptist Convention. And they're still doing that now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stayed there from 1981, I think, all the way up until 1992 as the chairman of the late night services of the National Baptist Convention.
And, you know, we almost had somebody writing a dissertation on late night, maybe some later on point in our group, maybe some later point, because late night was, what we say is, it was very formative for a lot of preachers.
Okay.
And preachers couldn't go to school. Late night was, you know, a primary pedagogical or teaching vessel by which a lot of people, so we were looking at it from its pedagogical, how do preachers learn to preach? How are preachers mentored in preaching? And late night did a lot of that. So that's the background out of which I asked you that question.
Okay.
We thought that there's so much of Black preaching that has not been studied and has not been written about, and the history has not been told, that at some point we hope that somebody would write on that, because it was pedagogy, it was teaching. It really was. It was a lot of things now, you know, it was hooping and it was a lot of things, but also imitation and learning, you know, how to preach. I got a question from the class about people want to know a little bit more about your preparation process.
Yes.
So can you back up and go back there just a little bit?
Yes. Okay. You want me to tell you how I do it? Is that?
Yeah. How do you prepare? What?
Well, I have a team of people that provide me information. For example, if I'm going to preach on Pentecost, I'll call a team of people that will go to the computer, get articles or get sermons or get various things that I am wanting. And I keep on until I know I have enough to do what I want to do. And I sit down and I write. I don't like going to the computer to do those kinds of things for me, because my writing it going the long way, the hard way, allows me to conceptualize it a lot more and to hold it as I do it. And then I have to decipher what I have. So my first draft may be something like 14, 15, 16 pages.
Mm-hmm.
Second draft may be 12 pages.
Mm-hmm.
The third draft may be, write it again, it may be 8, all the way down, but I have to get it on a certain size sheet that I have, less than 2. And I know it's going to be a certain length of time, and I know that this is the way that I need it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that I do, a lot of preachers say that they let the Holy Spirit guide them with their closings, but I don't. If the Holy Spirit doesn't come while I'm writing that closing, he's got to leave me alone when I get to that pulpit. I mean, I write it all. You know what I'm saying? That's just me, my style. And I would suggest to any preacher who's listening to me, and those of you who are in school, that's the way you do it. You do what's best for you. You know, you there's no certain way that it has to be done. I just thank God that He's allowed me to be 77 years old, and I still have the desire to study.
Mm-hmm.
And so I play racquetball. I do everything. I take vitamins all day, every day. I do everything that I need to keep myself to where I can preach as good and long as I can, because that's all I want to do. Again, when I'm finished with this world, I'm through with this world when I can't preach.
So let me go back. One quick question. So do you